Sarah, thank you to the whole Tiffin community and your associates and everybody. It's great to be here, and I really applaud you for taking a whole week to reflect on Franciscan charism and spirituality. It is a gift not just for Franciscans, obviously. It's a gift that is meant to be shared. What a wonderful way to do it, to share who we are and to focus on one of the main attributes of our Franciscan charism, our Franciscan spirituality, which is to be builders and makers and bridges of peace. So as you heard, I'm here to reflect on St. Francis as a man of peace. And you know, that's not just a modern reading of St. Francis. That's what he was known for in his own time. That's how he greeted people everywhere he went. Francis radiated peace wherever he went. And I think the Franciscan charism in this day needs to do the same thing in a world that is very troubled, a world that is very divided, a world where we insulate ourselves rather than face an encounter as another Francis, Pope Francis, is inviting us to do again and again. So let's listen to what Thomas of Celano, the first official biographer of St. Francis, wrote as he prepared the life of St. Francis for his canonization. So we're talking 800 years ago. This is one of the ways that Thomas of Celano described Francis of Assisi. He then began to preach penance with a fervent spirit and a joyful attitude. He inspired his listeners with words that were simple and a heart that was heroic. His word was like a blazing fire, reaching the deepest parts of the heart and filling the souls of all with wonder. He seemed entirely different than what had been, and looking up to heaven, he refused to look down upon earth. It is truly amazing that he first began to preach where he had learned to read as a little boy, and where at first he was reverently buried, a reference to the original Church of St. George of Assisi. Thus, a blessed beginning was confirmed by a more blessed end. Where he learned, there he also taught, and where he began, there he blessedly ended. In all his preaching, before he presented the word of God to the assembly, he prayed for peace, saying, "May the Lord give you peace." And he always proclaimed this to men and women, to those he met and to those who met him. Accordingly, many who hated peace, along with salvation, with the Lord's help, wholeheartedly embraced peace. They became themselves children of peace, new rivals for eternal salvation. Among these, there was a man from Assisi with a holy and simple character, who was the first to follow devoutly the man of God. After him, Brother Bernard, embracing the delegation of peace, eagerly ran after the holy man of God to gain the kingdom of heaven. So Thomas of Celano, the first biographer of Francis, describes this new movement that Francis founded as a delegation of peace. And that was in fact what they were sent into the world to do, to bring about peace among rivaling neighbors, among enemies, among political figures, into the lands that they went. They were messengers and troubadours of peace. The whole life that Thomas of Celano provides for us of St. Francis is the account of a profound conversion that unfolds over the decades of Francis's life. A profound conversion from a life that was oriented towards upward mobility and the desire of a higher status in life. That's what he was born to look for. That's what his father and mother wanted for him. They were cloth merchants. They had means, but in a land that in a place and a time where land meant everything, they couldn't achieve a higher social status without land. And the only way to get land was to take it from somebody else, to be knighted and given a parcel of land so that one had a title that went with it, or to inherit land. Francis, in his conversion process, rejects that because he learns that it's not very fulfilling. His conversion from pursuit of worldly ambitions and a higher status of life came about by his encounter with the poor, and through the poor, his encounter with Christ. And it led him to a freedom from detachment from possessions, and maybe even more importantly, a detachment from ambition that leads to deep freedom, and Francis joyfully wishes to share with others. We've been reflecting on peace and the manifestations of peace all week. And hopefully we've understood that the peace that is described in Francis's life, just as the peace that Christ mentions as his gift to us, has more to do with the Hebrew concept of shalom, which is well-being, an entire well-being. It's holistic. It has much more to do with that Hebrew understanding of shalom than it does with the Pax Romana, or the peace of the Roman Empire, which was simply the absence of war. So the Roman Empire made peace a high priority, but peace for them often involved trampling over people and taking away all their rights, and if they couldn't speak up anymore, they were at peace. And if they didn't rebel, they were at peace. Jesus rejected that understanding of peace, and St. Francis embodies the kind of peace that comes from the biblical tradition, that shalom, a peace that is rooted in right relationship with God and simultaneously right relationship with our neighbor. So the concept of peace, the holistic well-being, is much more than the absence of war and conflict. Yet, of course, they are related. For Francis, to talk about Francis as a man of peace already indicates what's most important, that the man is the message. The person is the message. It's not so much what he said or what he wrote, it's what he did. It's how he lived his life. So just as Francis instructed his brothers to preach before opening their mouths, he said, if you ascend to the pulpit and you haven't preached before you open your mouth, don't bother because you have nothing to say. You see the bumper sticker probably that says, preach the gospel at all times, when necessary use words. Actions speak louder than words. And Francis embodied that. Now, part of the reason that Francis could embody that so naturally is he was figuring out what he was supposed to do day after day. That was part of this ongoing conversion. He didn't have the master plan ahead of time. He didn't have the goals laid out, and this is what I'm going to accomplish, and by this age I'm going to be this. He threw that away as part of this conversion. And he allowed his day, his weeks, his years to unfold according to God's plan. And his conversion was about always turning towards God and allowing God to be God, that is, allowing God to be in charge. His transparency, he didn't hide his sinfulness, he didn't hide his desire for conversion, he didn't even hide the fact that he didn't know what the next step was most of the time. His transparency in this lifelong process of conversion was the most eloquent sermon he gave. He was discerning his way, and others saw the authenticity with which he did that and wished to join him. Francis had no pretensions or airs. He was painfully aware of his own sinfulness and unworthiness. But that awareness of his sinfulness and unworthiness didn't lead to self-hatred, didn't lead to despair, didn't lead to what we would call today a low self-image or a disparaging attitude about himself. On the contrary, it opened himself up to a merciful God, to a benevolent God, to an all-loving God, whose embrace he was happy to receive, and then be the transmitter of that embrace to more and more people. He became the instrument of God's love for so many people. So it's without wonder that Thomas of Celano would say that Francis radiated peace, a peace that was much larger than himself. Now his conversion is all the more drastic because before embracing that poverty, as I said, Francis was in pursuit of material wealth. And since he was very rich, Thomas says, he was not greedy, but he was extravagant. He wasn't a hoarder of money, but he was a squanderer of property, especially his father's. He was a prudent dealer, but a most unworthy steward. So he had to transform his whole value system, his priorities and goals as part of this conversion before discovering the peace that he could then radiate to others. Before becoming a troubadour of peace, he was actually pursuing glorification in war. The way to win that nobility and that title for his family. The way to personal glory. Again, Thomas relates, a certain nobleman from the city of Assisi was furnishing himself on a large scale with military weaponry, and swollen by the wind of empty glory, what a great line, swollen by the wind of empty glory, he asserted solemnly that he was going to Apulia to enrich himself in money or distinction. Now, Apulia is where Pope Innocent III's troops were fighting against the rival to the Emperor Frederick II. When Francis heard of this planned trip to Apulia to get arms, and because he was whimsical, Thomas says, and overly daring, he agreed to go with him. Although Francis did not equal him in nobility of birth, he did outrank him in graciousness, and though poorer in wealth, he was richer in generosity. So Francis, filled with desire for this journey, had a dream in which it seemed to him the whole house was filled with soldiers' arms, saddles, shields, spears, and other equipment. And though delighting for the most part, he silently wondered to himself about its meaning. He was suddenly bewildered at the sudden turn of events and the response that these arms were to be for him and his soldiers. But Thomas will explain the arms were not for doing battle as he imagined. They were for the liberation of God's people. It's a fine thing, Thomas says, that at the outset mention be made of arms, and very fitting that arms be handed over to a soldier about to do battle with one strong and fully armed. Then, like a second David, in the name of the Lord God of hosts, from the long-standing abuse of its enemies, he might liberate Israel. Francis has experienced a transition in what he was looking for and what would satisfy those longings, and begins to realize it's not going to come from weapons, but it's going to come from another struggle. The struggle to overcome oneself and one's own will, the struggle to open oneself to God and allow God's will to be supreme, the struggle to free people from their desire to possess and to dominate. And we know from history that Francis' first venture into actual physical war removed any lingering glorification of violence in his mind. So this profession that he idealized and was taught to idealize of being a soldier becomes something that is anything but glorious in his experience. His first attempt at battle, he ends up a prisoner of war, and he ends up imprisoned and in a dungeon, and none of his friends and drinking buddies from before come around to visit him. He's alone with his thoughts, he's alone with God, and he's alone with the stirrings of his own soul that are part of God's plan, unbeknownst to Francis, and part of his own journey of conversion. So it's only after emptying himself of himself and his ambitions that he was really open to the experiences that God had in store for him. Key experiences in his conversion story. The experience of San Damiano. Hopefully you've heard that story, or at least know a little bit about it, where Francis is out in the woods praying in an abandoned church because he was a lost soul. When he was freed from that dungeon in prison, it's not that he had a goal in mind, he was lost. His previous ambitions and ideals were shattered, and he's left with nothing. So I've often likened him to the first prolonged adolescent. He goes through lots of experiences and doesn't know where his life is taking him. He's lost. And he finds comfort and consolation praying in churches, and one in particular that was falling down. It was in ruins. But he was mesmerized by a Byzantine icon of the crucified Christ. And he actually hears that crucified Christ speaking to him, saying, "Francis, rebuild my church." And because he was looking for direction, he was looking for something to do with his life, he goes around and begs for stones and mortar to actually go about the work of physically rebuilding that church. Well, that infuriates his father, who's on this path of upward mobility. It's not bad enough that his son's gone half crazy, but now he's begging and embarrassing us. And so his father actually turns him over to the bishop to be judged. But the experience of San Damiano, the experience of hearing the cross, gives him some sense of direction. He encounters Christ speaking to him, but even that experience only becomes real and only becomes connected to his experience in real life when he encounters the leper. And again, he tells us that story as well, how Francis was riding along on a horse. He was always generous to the poor. He always was compassionate and sympathetic for those who had less than himself. He was concerned about lepers, but at the same time repulsed by them. Because 800 Years ago, lepers weren't treated any better than they were 2,000 years ago or before that in scriptures. Lepers were kept at a distance, they were contagious, they were symbols of dying in pieces. They were disgusting, they smelled, they were horrible to look at. And so Francis always felt sorry for the lepers, and he would throw a coin at them from a distance. But he tells us that he was riding along one time and he sees a leper who has to ring a bell and has to keep everybody away from him. He sees a leper and something bigger than himself compels him not to go in the opposite direction, which is where his instincts would take him, but to go towards that leper. And not only throw a coin at that leper from a distance, but to get off his horse and place the coin in the leper's hand, breaking through barriers, taboos, but creating a genuine encounter that is transformative. And only looking back, because that's how we learn most lessons in life, only looking back does he make the connection, does he see the connection between that Christ on the cross speaking to him and that leper that he encounters, who is utterly vulnerable, utterly needy, and yet reveals something to Francis about what it is to be human, the humanity that God chose for himself in the Incarnation. From the experience of San Damiano and that church, Francis not only receives instructions whose meaning he doesn't yet fully grasp, but also an experience of humility. The upwardly mobile would-be hero in battle becomes a beggar of stone and mortar. And in doing so, he discovers a happiness he hadn't previously known. And from the experience of the encounter with the leper, which leads to more encounters with lepers, which leads him to willingly washing the feet of lepers and providing comfort and aid to the dying, from that experience of the leper to his humility, newfound humility, is added a deepened compassion, a genuine encounter that leads to joy in humble service. Much more exciting for him than working in his father's cloth shop. Much more exciting than riding in a horse suited out in armor and going off to battle. Much more exciting than the pursuit of pleasure. And this becomes so central to the understanding of Francis, an encounter with Christ that strips away all pretenses. Francis discovers who he is in emptying himself and encountering the other to whom he can show mercy. And again, it's looking back on the experiences as teacher in life that Francis realizes that the privilege of serving these outcasts give him some sense of what God does for us. The mercy that he extends to the leper is a manifestation, a representation of the mercy that God has extended to us. He begins to make sense of those things. So when challenged by his father, and after stripping off his clothes in front of everyone in the public square after being judged by the bishop, he renounced his family and wealth, and he discovers true freedom all the more completely, and he is inwardly at peace. He hands those clothes over to his father and says, "Now I no longer have any father on earth except my Father in heaven." And the bishop, out of probably embarrassment or shame, goes over and covers Francis with his cloak. But even that gesture becomes so meaningful as Francis finds his place within the church, and he leads to a rebuilding of the church that has more to do with the institution and its members than it does with the falling walls at San Damiano. In his radical conversion, Francis, certainly without full awareness, not only discovers something about himself, he discovers who he is in relationship to God. His encounter strips away a false notion of God. And in the words of the Capuchin friar David Couturier, he trades the imperial God of the Crusaders, the dominant representation of God at that time in history. God was leading the charge. God was victorious in battle. God was claiming land once again. He trades the imperial God of the Crusades, a God of dominance and destruction, a God of power, might, and glory, for the humble God, the God of compassion, the God of the poor and the leper, the God revealed in the child of Bethlehem and in the crucified Savior on the cross. In this newfound freedom and its source in Christ, revealed in the cross, in the church, and in the person of the leper, That is what Francis wishes to share. And he's animated to share his experience, and he does it in gesture and word. He radiates peace, and he proclaims a gospel of peace, the good news of freedom. Peace that Francis experiences and is able to convey comes from his own experience of transformation, his own experience of conversion. It's not a result of his achievements. It's not about meeting the goals that he set for himself. It's about responding to the initiative that God takes in his life. In other words, this new freedom is a gift, not something he earned. It's not rooted in physical well-being. It's not rooted in security, the things that we often convince ourselves are necessary for peace and well-being. It flows from an emptying of self, an emptying of ambition, and abandonment to the all-provident God. It's discovered through the suffering Jesus, with his arms open wide in embrace. It's discovered through the suffering leper, who is receptive to this grace of an embrace after being isolated from society. Now, the peace of Francis is not immune from suffering. On the contrary, his peace is not a feel-good experience. Far from it. It is an overwhelming awareness that real suffering is indeed redemptive. It's not permanent. It is redemptive. It's worthwhile because it leads to deepened compassion. It's the price of gentleness. It makes us whole. And that suffering will ultimately be transformed by God, the message of the risen Christ. The experience of the crucified Jesus, not only the image hanging in that church, but more importantly, the image of Christ in the leper incarnate, leads Francis to search for a deeper understanding of the mystery of the incarnation. What moved God to become one of us? What moved the eternal to enter into time and space? What moved the eternal to accept the limitations of a human body? The incarnation is God's most perfect expression of his own option for the poor. God embraces the poverty, the limitation, the vulnerability of the human condition. God, the all-powerful, becomes vulnerable. As an infant born to a temporarily homeless couple at the beginning of his life, and as a rejected convict crucified between murderers at the end of his life. The more Francis embraced the divine poverty made flesh in Jesus, the greater peace and freedom he experienced. The less he was interested in strength and power, the more he found it in the vulnerable and the poor. He discovered that the poverty of Jesus and his apostles, freely chosen, was the key to their freedom and the key to peace. He became a living commentary on the gospel. Don't read it, watch me. He wouldn't say those words, but that's what his effect eventually was. A living commentary on the gospel. And at the same time, he then becomes a living critique of an increasingly materialistic culture, which is inevitably enslaving those who buy into its value. I fall into the tendency, I think most of us do, to think all of this materialism and consumerism and all of the troubles that we have today, even the secularization, to think of them as a new thing. We find it at every page of human history, pushing God to the margins, emphasizing what we do for ourselves, the accumulation of things, and the breakdown of relationships. We're not unique in that. We may experience it more completely today, but we're not unique in that. It's in every moment in history. In one of his simplest explanations for the importance of voluntary poverty, Francis told his brothers, if you have things and you have property, you need to defend them. And then you're back to the power struggle, which diminishes freedom. Protection, defense, diminishes freedom. Franciscans have yet to learn this lesson in the same way that Francis lived it. To speak of Francis as a man of peace, a troubadour of peace, one who preached and radiated peace, today we can't help but think of another Francis. Francis, the Bishop of Rome, chosen from the ends of the earth, as he said, who radiates joy and who works tirelessly for peace. In his apostolic exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis, the first Jesuit pope, reveals that he is Franciscan in more than just his name. Without any claim to knowledge or mastery of Franciscan texts, Pope Francis, who is rebuilding the church in our day and before our eyes, really describes the method of Francis and offers it to us as essential for the Christian life. Like St. Francis, the original Francis, the man is the message. So we see a lived expression of the joy Pope Francis conveys in this text. In that apostolic exhortation, Pope Francis repeatedly states the necessity for an encounter with the living God and the periphery of humanity, the margins, the outcast, the periphery of humanity as being the most likely place for that genuine encounter to occur. A genuine encounter with Christ fills one with peace and overflowing joy that moves one outside of oneself into mission. That could be a description of Francis's life. Pope Francis' whole emphasis on missionary activity, and the phrases he used are getting bruised in the streets for taking chances, not being sick because of being cooped up. That's what he's calling the church to. Of making a mess, what he told the youth in Rio de Janeiro. In other words, not settling for things as they are, not settling for the status quo. That comes from the joy of this encounter with Christ, whose good news must be shared and turns upside down the values of the world. The missionary option which Francis wills for the whole church, Pope Francis wills for the whole church, of the poor and for the poor, simply means preaching the gospel, sharing the good news. And as a Franciscan, I see that missionary option as indistinguishable from preaching peace, the way Thomas of Celano described it. He rightly grasped it 8 centuries ago. An encounter with the living Christ, suffering and vulnerable, that moves one to reach out to the suffering in our midst and find freedom and happiness in doing so. Prompts us to move outside of ourselves and discover greater freedom by doing more of the same. St. Francis' joy was contagious. People sought him out. He didn't mind looking foolish or doing things that looked strange. One of his old drinking buddies from before his conversion, his so-called life in the world, one day asked St. Francis if he was in love. He was acting so strange. Yes, he was in love, he said. He was in love with Lady Poverty. He acted like someone in love with God and in love with all God's creation. And that was attractive. People in love are attractive. The joy radiates from them, and others wish to share what they have. That was attractive. And that's precisely what Pope Francis wants to see in the church today. In fact, Pope Francis says in that apostolic exhortation that one of the greatest obstacles to the spread of the gospel today is a lack of joy. Lack of joy, frequently accompanied by finger wagging and scolding, rather than the mercy of God generously shared, the embrace ever widened. Thomas of Celano, who throughout his biography calls Francis the preacher of peace, uses the word joy numerous times to characterize the major events in the life of Francis which contributed to his sense of peace. Some of those we would automatically see as joyful, but not all of them. Joy when Francis was called to the court of the bishop because his father was suing him, called to judgment, he went with joy. Joy when thrown into the snow by a group of bandits who were disappointed he had nothing to give them. Joy when exchanging his own clothes for the clothes of a beggar. Joy at the conversion of others, seeing God's word take root in their hearts. Indescribable joy at the forgiveness of sins, his own and others. Joy at the vision he had of the future growth of the order. Joy at coming together with the brothers. Joy at prayer and contemplation. Joy at being in the little church of Our Lady of the Angels that he rebuilt, where each of them had a little tiny space where to lay their head. Joy at being in that place, begging for their existence. Joy because the birds were listening to him, even though the people weren't. Joy when the blind woman was given sight. Joy characterizes his death. Joy characterizes his funeral and burial. Francis even rejoiced in his sins. He rejoiced in his sins because he said, how else would I experience the richness of God's mercy? Joy in beggars, joy at the stigmata, sharing physically in the wounds of Christ. You get the point. It's a joy that is pervasive of his whole being, his whole self. A great example, a beautiful example of that joy, again in Solano's first life of Francis, is when Francis has the opportunity to address the Pope and the cardinals. As he stood in the presence of so many princes of the church, Blessed Francis, after receiving permission and a blessing, fearlessly began to speak. He was speaking with such fire of spirit that he couldn't contain himself for joy. As he brought forth the word from his mouth, he moved his feet as if dancing, not playfully, but burning with the fire of divine love, not provoking laughter, but moving them to tears of sorrow. For many of them were touched in their hearts, amazed at the grace of God and the great determination of this man. So whether speaking to poor peasants in the town square or to princes of the church, Francis's joy, born of the good news, born of his encounter with Christ, was contagious, and that joy became a force for renewal and a force for peace. In his earlier rule for the brothers, Francis says, let the brothers be careful not to appear as outwardly sad and gloomy hypocrites, but let them show themselves to be joyful, cheerful, and consistently gracious in the Lord. Pope Francis laments Catholics that look like Lent without Easter, or as if they're always coming from funerals. St. Francis can speak even of joyful penance. Joyful penance. It's a bizarre contradiction to one who hasn't experienced the joy of encountering Christ in the poor and suffering. But for Francis, once he discovered that joy in suffering and was willing to empty himself to really enter into that experience, a life of penance for Francis was not a life of dread and misery, but a recognition of that conversion of self-interest and the vain pursuit of happiness to a self-emptying and compassion towards others, which allows one to experience the mercy of God very tangibly, very concretely. Again, Pope Francis says, the great danger in today's world, pervaded as it is by consumerism, is the desolation and anguish born of a complacent yet covetous heart, the feverish pursuit of frivolous pleasure, and a blunted conscience. Whenever our interior life becomes caught up in its own interests and concerns, there is no longer room for others, no place for the poor. Then God's voice is no longer heard. The quiet joy of his love is no longer felt, and the desire to do good fades. This is a very real danger for believers too. Many fall prey to it and end up resentful, angry, and listless. It's no way to live a dignified and fulfilled life. It's not God's will for us, nor is it the life of the Spirit, which has its source in the heart of the risen Christ. We just witnessed an incredible event when Pope Francis visited the United States, and what is called the Francis effect is it just continues to reach more and more people who didn't necessarily have that personal contact with Francis, but saw him in their living rooms on television and heard his words and saw the gestures. Whether it was the great motorcade with all these big vehicles, and then the Pope getting out of what looks like a clown car, this little Fiat, action speaking louder than words, or when he leaves the halls of Congress and goes to a soup kitchen and addresses the homeless there and says, I've seen you before. Now wait a minute, I've heard your story. It's a story of Mary and Joseph, the little baby that had to flee in order to provide a better life for that baby when the king was about to kill him. He connects on that level with people and radiates a joy that is so rooted in the gospel and always mindful of those on the margins, always mindful of those on the periphery. Peace for St. Francis, peace for Pope Francis is interconnected with joy. It's an inner sense which carries him through great trials and the ongoing process of conversion. St. Francis began to experience freedom again when he was freed from ambitions which were not fully his own, and free from the pursuit of material things, wealth, and social prestige. And as fruitful and life-giving as his encounter with the leper and his encounter with the crucified Christ were, he would discover that the self-emptying that brought peace and joy was a continuous process. It wasn't just those moments. It was how those moments unfolded throughout the course of his life. In the course of his life, once freed from the pursuit of material things, he found himself owning his ideals and owning his values, owning his way of living the gospel. So again, he was forced by circumstances, forced by the growth of the order, to set aside his control of that, empty himself once again. And he found that was even harder to let go of than the material things. But again, he found joy in doing so. And in doing so, he opened himself even more completely to the mercy and love of God. So much to the point that he didn't want to go back to ministry and didn't want to go back to preaching. He just wanted to enjoy that contemplation. Until St. Clare told him, "You're needed back there. You need to continue to convey the gospel. You need to continue to call people to conversion. You need to continue attracting people by the authenticity and simplicity of your way of life." Francis had to continually renew that source of peace and joy through deeper contemplation. The result of that desire for greater contemplation was not either or, but carving out more time and space in his life to cultivate that, and at the same time to share the results of that with others. He had to renew that source of peace, that deeper contemplation. He had to renew that surrender, even of control, of the movement that he started. Francis discovered peace and joy by imitating the God who became poor for our sake. Joy, peace, conversion, penance, mission, they're all interconnected, and they all come from the encounter with Christ, suffering and triumphant, Christ who reigns. As Francis said from his deathbed, "I have done what was mine to do. May Christ teach you what you are to do." May Christ teach us the way to peace in our time. May Christ teach us the way to conversion and to self-surrender so that we might experience the joy of the gospel. May Christ allow peace to radiate forth from us and make a difference in divided and war-torn world, in divided families, divided society, and divided government, divided every aspect of our life. May we radiate that peace that comes from letting go, allowing God to be in control, and encountering Christ through the suffering. Thank you.